Year 1983. Flashdance and Return of the Jedi are box office hits. Michael Jackson performs Billie Jean. The American president is Reagan. Yuri Andropov is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Thatcher, Kohl, and Krakse are the leaders of Great Britain, Germany, and Italy. The Soviets are involved in the Afghanistan War. Iran and Iraq are at war since 1980. Last year, British won the Falkland War. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West is in full swing. Reagan labels the Soviet Union an evil empire. In March, Reagan proposes the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars. Tensions increases with the anticipated arrival of Pershing II and Griffin missiles in Europe. The Pershing II is a very accurate ballistic missile and could reach Moscow in 8 minutes. The deployment of the new nuclear weapons worries the Soviet leadership. There are already the first symptoms of weakness of the Soviet communist system. Economic stagnation, unrest in Afghanistan, the rise of Solidarnosc in Poland. If we are weak and they're getting stronger, they will soon attack us, think some of the Soviet leaders. April 4th, 6 U.S. aircraft fly over the Kuril Islands, violating the Soviet airspace. September 1st, the civilian Korean Airlines Flight 007, with 269 passengers, enters the Soviet airspace, and it's shot down. Soviets believed it was another American military aircraft. Politburo suspect that the civilian airplane was deliberately sent over Soviet air defenses in order to create a scandal. October 5th, the Solidarnosc leader Lech Walesa wins the Nobel Peace Prize, another provocation. October 25th, U.S. forces invade Grenada and overthrow the communist government. September 1983, NATO announces that, in November, there will be Able Archer 83, a very realistic military exercitation dangerously close to Soviet borders, that will simulate a Warsaw Pact invasion and a nuclear attack. Some members of the Politburo and the KGB chairman, Viktor Ebrakov, suspect that Able Archer 83 is a cover for a surprise Western nuclear attack. The Kremlin asks again to cancel Able Archer exercise and to stop the deployment of the missiles in Europe, too close to their border. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States was within hours of starting a war, for the exact same reasons. November 2nd, while all U.S. foreign military bases are in alert, officially because of 2 truck bombs in Beirut, who killed 300 Western soldiers, Able Archer 83 exercise starts. The Warsaw Pact begins the mobilization. All the aviation units are on alert. ICBMs are prepared for a possible launch. Spetsnaz, the special units, cross the borders of Western countries, disguised as tourists. November 8th, Kremlin learned that, early in the morning of November 12th, during Able Archer exercise, the Western leaders Reagan, Thatcher, and Kohl will be relocated to secret shelters. This move confirms Soviet fears. The war could start very soon. November 9th, 8 a.m., extraordinary meeting in the Kremlin, with all the members of the Politburo. Andropov insists to take action immediately, with a nuclear preemptive attack. But Ustinov, the defense minister, note that the American retaliation to a nuclear attack will kill more than 50 million Russian people. The NATO attack could be prevented with a conventional invasion of Europe. Warsaw Pact armies could reach the River Rhine in 7 days, disrupting the enemy nuclear preparations. The Soviet Category A units in Eastern Europe are maintained at full combat readiness at all times. They could attack within just a few hours. Mikhail Gorbachev thinks that it's better to use diplomatic channels before any military attack. But the majority of the war cabinet fear that this could uncover Soviet plans and anticipate the American nuclear strike. Gromyko, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, thinks that a NATO attack is improbable, but USA are highly aggressive, and they will attack, soon, or later, so, better to attack first. The decision is taken. It will be war. Marshal Sergei Akhromayev, Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, has the order to invade Europe. November 9, 13 a.m. All the Warsaw Pact's units are on the move. Air assault brigades are taken by AN-22 Antonov and civil aeroflot planes. WW3 submarines, armed with SSN-8 ballistic missiles, sneak under the ice cap of the Arctic, getting closer to Canadian coasts. Warsaw Pact tank units move to the German border. USA satellites detect the extensive Warsaw Pact preparations, and NATO begins to react. But NATO command believes it's only a demonstrative action, not a real attack. They are wrong. November 11, 3 a.m. Spetsnaz commandos sabotage electric power plants in Germany. At 5 o'clock, thousands of missiles and artillery shells are launched against NATO forward defenses in Germany. Warsaw Pact bombers, Tupolev Tu-95 Bear and Tu-22M backfire, launch bombs and air-to-surface missiles against the NATO air and naval bases in Europe and Alaska. The Tu-95 can drop 11 tons of load over a target. Anti-aircraft missiles and NATO fighters, F-15, F-16, cause huge losses to Soviet bombers. But the effects of this attack is devastating. Command centers, deposits, barracks, are hit. Almost all German airports are damaged. Then, at dawn, the Warsaw Pact armies cross the border into West Germany. The Third World War starts. Berlin, first day of war. The 4th and the 11th DDR Volksarmee divisions easily suppress the NATO defenses. In the Western Pacific, the Kitty Hawk carrier is damaged by 4 SSN-19 missiles. After many attempts to save the ship, the crew has to abandon it. Anti-ship missiles rarely sink major warships, but they start fires. Is the fire that ultimately kills large ships. The Soviet 7th Air Assault Division is airdropped behind the NATO lines in Denmark. November 11th, Polish and East German Marine units land in the Danish islands. The Soviet 106th Air Assault Division takes the strategic bridge of Domitz on the River Elbe. The Soviet 20th Guards Army engages the German 1st Corps near Wolfsburg. The Soviet 2nd Army, with the support of the Polish 1st and 2nd Army, advances through the Elbe River. The Germans and the Danish Corps are outnumbered and retreat. The NATO reaction is weak on all fronts. The surprise attack caught NATO completely off guard. In central Germany, the Soviet 8th Guards Army turn on the Fulda Gap, slowed by the resistance of the US 5th Corps, reinforced with the 8th U.S. Infantry Division. In southern Germany, the Soviet 1st Guard Tank Army, and 3 armored and 5 motor rifle divisions of the Czechoslovak People's Army, overcomes the defenses of the U.S. 7th Corps, and forces the German 2nd Corps to retreat. November 11th, British Northwood Headquarters, midnight. The Naval Command asks the authorization for launch of nuclear Polaris missiles on Moscow. Margaret Thatcher denied the permission. Actually, no nukes are hitting Britain. Reagan too authorizes only the use of conventional weapons for the moment. November 11th, 1 p.m. Second wave of bombings. Su-24 fencers drop bombs on all the targets, not enough damaged. In Germany, Italy, Alaska, Great Britain. The strike is successful, but, again, with huge losses. The Warsaw Pact main thrust come across the North German plain, the only area that favor the attacker. November 12th, second day of war. East Germany's army, the best of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact forces, with 2 armored and 4 mechanized divisions, attacks frontally the 3 armored divisions of the British Army of the Rhine. The British retreat to another defensive prepared position. Their mission is to slow down Warsaw Pact army, waiting for reinforcements. But the other NATO units, taken by surprise, remain in their positions. This leaves holes in the front line. November 14th, the Soviet Third Shock Army, with its T-64 tanks, run in, and disintegrates any defense. German First Army, the Dutch, and the Belgians, risk to be encircled, and quickly retreat. The American Fifth Corps, one of the best equipped in NATO, responsible to hold the line on the Fulda Gap, has exposed flanks. They are forced to leave their positions, and start a fighting retreat towards Frankfurt. The half-century of paranoia about the Russians surging through the Fulda Gap, the trillions of dollars spent on defense, were pointless. The Fulda Gap was the new Maginot Line. November 15th, Denmark falls. November 18th, the 20th, the 2nd, and 4 divisions of the 3rd Soviet Army, overcomes what remains of the German First Corps, and occupy Hamburg, and Hanover. They are stopped along the Weser River by the German Third Corps, the Belgian 1st, and by the British 4th Armoured Division, reinforced by fresh troops from UK. In the south, the Warsaw Pact forces halt the advance in front of Munich when they runs out of fuel and ammunitions. Norwegian Front, November 11th, 8 a.m. The Soviet Northern Fleet Marine Brigade land in the northern Norwegian islands, using ordinary warships and merchant vessels. The 69th and the 77th Soviet Rifle Divisions attack frontally Kirkenes. The Soviet 76th Air Assault Division lands at Tromsø, held by 3 brigades of the Norwegian Northern Army. Soviets are stopped by the heavily fortified coastal defenses. November 11th, Bulgarians invade European Turkey. The 3rd and 2nd Armies breaks the lines held by the Turkish First Corps. Then, they advance quickly along the highway for Istanbul. The Turkish retreats behind the Çatalya line. In Caucasus, the Soviets keep a defensive posture. High mountains, bad season, and in this front, Soviets have no first-line units. There is a string of local battles, which bring basically no results. France is not NATO member, and it's excluded by the Soviet attack. Yuli Vorontsov, the Soviet ambassador in Paris, ensure the French that they don't plan on going any further than the Rhine. French President François Mitterrand opts for a partial conflict. France enters the war, but French army and French nukes will be used only for the defense of national boundaries. From the Italian bases, NATO launches airstrikes against the advancing Warsaw Pact army in Germany, repeatedly crossing the Austrian airspace and violating Austrian neutrality. November 15th, after a short ultimatum, the Soviet Southern Army Group and the Hungarian Army with 1,000 tons 54 and T-55 tanks invade Austria. Taken by surprise, the little Austrian army is overcome in 4 days. Their standing army is only a division, and mobilizing mechanized reserve forces takes time. Wien is indefensible, it's immediately turned into a free city, and falls. But the retreating Austrian troops destroy the Alpine tunnels and bridges, giving the Italian army enough time to bring in reinforcements. Giulia and Tridentina Italian Alpine Brigades, and the Ariete Armored Division. The Soviets are halted along the Alps. Over Germany, in the first week, Soviets has the air supremacy. NATO air power is technologically superior to Warsaw Pact, but they have low numbers, and suffered heavy losses during the first hours of the surprise attack. The Warsaw Pact bombers hit railways, nodes, bridges, and harbors in Germany, Italy, Norway, and Turkey. Air raids against more distant targets in UK, Spain, Greenland, and Alaska mostly fails. The USA soil is untouched, but it's difficult to bomb the Soviet soil too. The Soviets have the most massive air defenses in the world, with about 7,000 radars, and an extensive variety of missile weapon systems. The S-300 SAM is already operational. NATO F-111, Harriers, A-10, F-4 Phantoms, F-16, and Tornadoes spend the first week of war just trying to knock out SAM sites and mobile radars, while fighting hordes of Soviet interceptors. The main dogfights are F-15 on one side and MiG-25 on the other. The best fighters of 1983 are probably the F-16 and the MiG-29. But there are less than 50 MiG-29 in service. The B-52 are useless over East Europe, with all Warsaw Pact radars and air defenses still functional. They are limited to deep penetrations over less defended airspace in Siberia. Only the stealth F-117, based in Britain and in Keflavik, in Iceland, are effective, but there are only 18 F-117, and they are too slow to reach targets deep in Russia. At sea, the NATO naval forces dominate everywhere. 2/3 of the Soviet vessels are lost in the first 4 days. 3 of the 4 Kiev-class aircraft carriers, 2 of the 4 Kirov-class battlecruiser, are sunk almost immediately. The U.S. carriers are at present located here. Soviet Navy main task is to sever the naval supply lines from North America to Europe. The Soviets aren't concerned with the number of USA infantry being flown over. They need to prevent tanks and other equipment from coming across. Most of the Soviet attack submarines are concentrated in defensive missions. Only 3 Charlie-class submarines and few Alpha and Victor-class attack submarines enter in North Atlantic. They have some success. November 23, a convoy is attacked with a salvo of 8 SSN-9 Siren missiles, launched by Charlie K-458, at a 80 km range. 2 merchant ships are sunk, one of them full of new M1 Abram tanks. Another Charlie, in the Caribbean Sea, hit a tanker which have just crossed the Panama Canal, and is not yet protected by a convoy. The few sinkings don't come remotely close to halting U.S. resupply convoys to Europe. The Soviet submarines only slow the flow supplies. NATO is forced to form convoys, escort them with anti-submarine units, and cover them with aircraft based on the Coral Sea and Midway carriers. This takes time. They have little work to do. But Soviet submarines are still there, armed, and dangerous. The Europe is in flame. And the fire soon spreads all over the world. Korea. The 1st and the 2nd North Korean Corps begin an offensive along the west coast heading to Seoul. The South Korean 3rd Army and the U.S. 2nd Division, supported by a heavy artillery barrage, hold the line. The U.S. naval aviation has the full control of the air. The North Korean MiG-21, Su-7, and Il-28 are shot down. Soviet Far East Air Force try to support the North Koreans with MiG-23 and Su-24 bombers, with few results. The 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force and 25th Infantry Division from Hawaii quickly arrive in South Korea, along with Australian 1st Division and the New Zealand 1st Brigade. The attack is stopped north of Seoul. The North Koreans bomb Seoul every day with artillery. Casualties, civilians and military, are ugly. Very few are allowed to become prisoners. Nicaragua. The FDN guerrilla force invades the pro-Soviet Nicaragua, helped by the U.S. heli-borne 1st Marine Division. Schwarzkopf has the command of the operations. Cuba. Castro sided with Soviets from the start of the war, but he avoided any direct assault on the base of Guantanamo, and denied the authorization to Soviet Bear bombers to land in Cuba. They might attract unwelcomed attention of the U.S. nukes. Cuba is the long arm of Soviet Union in the Third World. There are Soviet submarines in the base of Cienfuegos. Grumman A-6 intruders and B-52 bombed Cuba from the start of the war. USA fear that Cuba could provide the Soviets with bases for missiles. An invasion is impossible. All USA soldiers are desperately needed in Europe. A naval blockade is established, but to control any access is impossible, and the danger remains. Aden, South Yemen. The little Soviet base is destroyed, with the B-52 based in Diego Garcia. Vietnam declared neutrality at the beginning of the war. But there is a Soviet base in Cam Ranh, with 20 ships, Victor-class attack submarines, and 295 bombers. The Soviets don't need any authorization from Vietnam government to use the base, but Vietnam is doing little to assist the Soviets. The Soviets have no power projection, the capacity to deploy and sustain forces outside Europe. So, in this situation, a war could turn in a Vietnam against the world. USA, from the Philippines bases, Subic Bay and Clark Field, begins a daily bombing over Cam Ranh. The Soviet submarines cease to be a menace. There are no other active war in Indochina. Nobody wants a new Vietnam War. Namibia. Cuban troops and the Angolan MPLA forces enter Namibia, hoping for an insurrection against the white South Africa. But the offensive is easily stopped by South African forces. In the Middle East, an assault on the Golan Heights by the Syrian First Corps is repulsed. The Syrian T-62 are no match for the Israeli Merkava 2. The Syrian Second Corps takes the old controlled Tripoli. November 19, Arafat is killed. The Israeli 162nd Armored Division enters Lebanon. In Turkey, a Kurdish rebellion managed by the Kurdish Workers' Party starts. Sweden, remain neutral. The Premier Olof Palme orders the full mobilization, 850,000 men, preparing to repulse attacks from both NATO and Warsaw Pact. Switzerland too is mobilizing its 750,000 men. Yugoslavia is neutral and refuses offers by both sides. After Tito's death in 1980, ethnic tensions are growing. A war, on one side or the other, would rapidly become a civil war. Brazil offers an expeditionary force to be sent to the Europe as they did during World War II. Libya remains strictly neutral. Gaddafi is not mad. The Mediterranean is a NATO lake. In the Gulf, the Iraq-Iran war escalates day after day. Chemical weapons are more and more used. Japan has a little self-defense force, and they cannot raise a new army in just some weeks. They stay neutral, allowing USA to use the bases in their territory. Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu, initially, did not send troops in Europe, only allowing Soviet troops to cross his country. But Soviet Union can't allow such a defiance. After intense pressures, Romania sends 4 mechanist divisions and 2 tank divisions, with 750 T-55, to the Italian front. In China, the nuclear Dongfeng CSS-3 missiles are on high alert. Norwegian Front, November 18. The Soviet Mechanized Divisions 64th and 111th begin a wide encircling maneuver, violating the neutrality of Finland. Kalevi Sorsa, Finnish Prime Minister, orders to let the Soviet pass. Finnish forces in 1980s are poorly equipped, only 100 of T-55 tanks. To intervene against Soviet Union, if they invade a little and mostly inhabited strip of Finland, is a very hard choice. Especially if you fear an imminent nuclear escalation. Finland mobilizes 130,000 reservists in a week. They will not allow any other Soviet movement in their land. November 22, the Norwegians abandon part of the north to prevent the encirclement. November 23, German front. The Soviet Second Army occupy Bremen, sustaining huge losses. Bremenhaven, held by only 3,000 men of the German 26th Airborne Brigade, is taken the following day. The Germans, when possible, avoid fightings inside their cities. They don't want to turn them into tents of Stalingrad. Soviet's troops are sustained on the ground by Su-25 attack aircrafts and Mi-24 attack helicopters. But NATO mobile batteries and Stinger's shoulder missiles are really effective against them. November 25, the Soviet Third Army reached Dortmund and clashes with the 1st Belgian Corps and the German 3rd. The Soviet 8th Army push again on Frankfurt, held by US 5th Corps, which counterattacks in one of the few tank battle of the war. The US 1st Armored Division, equipped with M1 Abrams tanks, and the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Division, with Leopard 1, obtain an easy victory against the Czech T-55 tanks. Tank battles are very rare. The vast majority of the US armored force in Europe has M60 tanks. The USA field 2000 M1 first version tanks with the 105 mm cannon, but not all of them are in Germany. NATO has around 2,000 Leopard 1, half of them in Italy. 700 Leopard 2 are in the West German Armory. The French has the AMX-30. The first British Challenger 1 and Chieftain are arriving. NATO tanks quality is better, but Warsaw Pact has almost 50,000 tanks, with around 1,000 new T-80. And the average tank engagement ranges, in Europe, is less than 1 kilometer. So it's irrelevant if a better quality tank can destroy an enemy at 4,000 meters. November 26, in southern Germany, the Soviet 4th and 38th Armies, newly arrived from the Carpathian Military District, launch an offensive against the 2nd German Corps, in München. The Germans dig in a second defensive line, in front of Stuttgart. NATO is retreating on the whole front. After 2 weeks, over Europe, the Warsaw Pact starts to lose the air dominance. Anti-aircraft mobile batteries are getting better. Nike and Hercules missiles for high-altitude bombers, Rapiers and Hawks for low-altitude aircrafts. The first Patriot missile batteries arrive from USA. The new AGM-88 HARM missiles destroy the Warsaw Pact radars. Most of the Warsaw Pact raids against NATO's harbors and rearguards fails, despite they are escorted by large numbers of MiG-25. The A-10s inflict heavy losses to the armored columns and troops convoys in West Germany. Warsaw Pact cities are bombed: Prague, Budapest, Odessa, Warsaw, Dresden, Murmansk, Riga. Aircrafts continue to arrive from USA. There are even too few military airports available to operate all of them. A-64 Apache helicopters are for the first time in action near Frankfurt. The carriers are free from naval engagements once the Soviet fleet is no more a threat. But the air power cannot win the war alone. To be really effective, the air power needs a long campaign before the land war, in which the enemy defenses are slowly softened up, but this war immediately dive into a colossal fight. Kursk shows what happens when two sides start a battle with vast competent air forces. The two air forces largely cancelled each other. Sure, air power has an impact, but not a decisive impact, unless you are fighting astonishingly incompetent Arabian armies, sitting untrenched in the desert, like in Iraq. Or little countries like Serbia. In 1983 there are not precision-guided bombs, so NATO aircrafts have to stop an advance of tens of thousands of armored vehicles, with normal bombs. The war will be decided boots on the ground. And, on the ground, the Warsaw Pact has an advantage 3 versus 1. German front, December 1st. USA reinforcements and the best-equipped National Guard units are arriving. 82 airborne and 101 airborne are in Belgium. The Spanish and the Portuguese Corps are deployed in the Italian rears in Lombardia. The 1st Cavalry, 2nd Armored, 1st, 4th, 5th Heavy Infantry Divisions are already in France, but they are not yet ready. While the men could arrive by air in few hours, heavy equipments are delivered by Navy, and this takes time. Soviet logistical bases are closer to the front. To get a Soviet division from Minsk to Dortmund takes a week. To get a USA division from Texas to Duisburg takes 2 months. NATO has organized a defensive line from Stuttgart to the sea. But a linear defense against a mechanized assault is impossible. It was adopted repeatedly during World War II. By the French against the Germans in 1940, by the Russians against the Germans in 1941, and by the Allied in the Ardennes. Every time, the result was the same: a catastrophe for the defender. The NATO lines have a weak point. In the north, the 1st Netherlands Corps is weakened, the 1st German Corps is nearly destroyed, and the British were constantly in action since the beginning of the war. December 1st, the newly arrived 1st Guard Army and the 6th Guard Tank Army from Kiev district are deployed in North Germany and are immediately on the move. December 4th, the attack order is given. Soviets throw everything, even not full-strength divisions, at the Allied positions. The Soviet plan is an encircling maneuver through Netherlands and Belgium until the sea. The British 1st, 3rd, and 4th Armoured Division, attacked by the Soviet 20th Army, retreat inside the Ruhr. The Soviet 2nd Army and the entire 1st Guard Tank Army attack the Netherlands 3rd Division and the 1st German Corps. The defenses hold on for 2 days, then Allied retreat in the Netherlands. The Dutch destroy the dikes. Several polders are flooded. The Soviets, decimated by the battle and by air attacks, have not enough energies and reserves to launch a decisive push against NATO lines and stop the advance. The French 3rd Army Corps, with 380 AMX-30 tanks, enters Belgium. In the south, the Czech 4th Army and the Soviet 13th Armies attack the remnants of the German 2nd Corps. Then, the Soviet southern group of forces sweeps in the almost undefended Baden-Württemberg. Near Köln, the Belgian 1st Corps and the German 3rd Corps, attacked by the Soviet 1st Line units, retire. Then, the 2nd Echelon armies advance, unopposed, towards Koblenz. The USA 5th Army risks to be cut off. On the night between December 11th and 12th, Bessy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, personally orders to abandon Frankfurt. December 14th, the Warsaw Pact is on the river of the Rhine, after a month from the beginning of the war. China, with 5 million men already mobilized, is the great balance of the war. December 14th, early in the morning, Andropov calls Deng Xiaoping, offering him a non-aggression pact, the withdrawal from Mongolia and Vietnam, and free hand on Taiwan. In the meantime, Reagan calls Deng Xiaoping. He offers the North Korea, which could be governed by someone under Chinese protection, a negotiation on Taiwan, a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Korea, and adjustments along the Amur River border. The Chinese president doesn't promise anything to both. Deng thinks that Reagan's promises on Taiwan are nothing. And who cares of a couple of U.S. divisions in Korea? But joining the Soviet Union could be worse. A Soviet victory is unlikely. And in 1983, China military, while gigantic, is far, far less capable than NATO. China has nothing to gain on getting involved in this war. The longer the war, and the weaker the winner, the better for China. China will remain neutral. India is also mobilizing. India has good relations with the Soviets, and old and never solved hostilities along the borders. India is waiting for the development of the events. German front, December 16th, the Warsaw Pact is stopped along the Rhine. All bridges are destroyed, and the fast advance produced 2 long logistical lines. They have almost no fuel, and the bad weather prevents any large offensive operation. All Soviet Category A divisions are bled white. They can't advance further. NATO's situation is not better. The Allied lost a lot of equipment and guns when the rapidly moving Soviet forces overrun their lines. And the reinforcements from USA are not yet ready. A stalemate descends across Europe. Both sides suffers shortage of munitions from the first week of fight. Anyone ever correctly surmised how fast a modern army can exhaust war stocks? Apart from the heavy logistical problems, Soviets hesitate to attack France, a nuclear power. The French will not permit the fourth invasion of their territory in 100 years, indeed most of them made by the Germans. Behind the lines, the non-Soviet divisions are used as occupation forces. The Soviets consider them not entirely reliable. There are indeed very few riots, sabotages, and such like. All governments are preparing for a nuclear war. In Great Britain, the Queen stays at London, but Princess Anne take up residence in New Zealand to ensure the succession. Charles, Diana, and baby William are sent somewhere out of Britain, far from Soviet missiles. Evacuation measures are taken also for all European cities. France and Italy never built lot of shelter for population. Metro networks are partially transformed in shelter. Switzerland is the most prepared nations in Europe. The nuclear shelters covers all the population. The Sonnenberg Tunnel, alone, can host 20,000 people. In France and Italy, a huge problem is the flood of refugees from Austria and Germany. Andropov orders the quick relocation of all the industrial assets in Siberia, in underground facilities. Population of big cities are evacuated in collective farms. Ronald Reagan orders the execution of the crisis relocation plan, the evacuation of the large cities. Spontaneous evacuation are already started, in the countryside, between hills, and in Mexico, but nobody is looking into keeping this going for more than a month. Moscow, December 20th. Inside the Central Clinical Hospital, Andropov is thinking to the future. Andropov suffers of renal failure. He entered in the clinic in August 1983.
Когда наступит весна, у Варшавского договора будет достаточно сил, чтобы сломить сопротивление НАТО и вторгнуться во Францию. Я не верю, что Франция будет использовать ядерное оружие. Западное общественное мнение напугано ядерной войной. Италия держится, но на этом фронте у нас большое преимущество. И я уверен, что, если наши войска войдут в Италию, местные коммунисты помогут нам. В Эмилии уже действует подпольное коммунистическое движение. На данный момент, если НАТО не просит мира, вторжение на Британские острова может быть возможным. Наши воздушно-десантные силы превосходят численность всей британской армии. Королевский флот является тенью того, что было в 1940 году, и канал может быть закрыт противокорабельными ракетами. А потом... Мое здоровье быстро ухудшается. Я знаю, что я никогда не увижу окончательная победа.
December 20th, Casto, Belgium, NATO Supreme Headquarters. The snow falls all over Belgium. Inside his office, General Bernard Rogers, commander of NATO forces in Central Europe, has to take a decision.
The North Korean invasion has been stopped. Cuba is under control. Israel is advancing on Damascus. Moscow only sends the 104th from Afghanistan. Too little to stop the Israeli tanks. In Norway, the invasion by means of amphibious units has ended in the same way as it did in the 40s. Failure. In the Caucasus, the Soviets are on the defensive, with only 4 divisions of the 4th Army and the General Winter on their side. In Thrace, NATO outnumbers the Warsaw Pact, although the Greek and Turkish divisions are mainly infantry. In Afghanistan, the Russians are in trouble. There are daily terrorist attacks due to the CIA funding the Mujahideen. In Europe, the situation is critical. In the Alps of the Netherlands, there is an incredible concentration of Warsaw Pact forces. In the rear, there are other Warsaw Pact armies, not completely loyal, but formidable in theory. More Soviet units are advancing from the east. The 90th and 16th from Moscow, the 26th from Belarus, and the 47th, 65th, and 52nd from Poland, although most of them are ill-equipped, filled with reservists and the elderly. The Soviet Far East armies are arriving, a repeat of the shift west of the Siberian Army during World War II. The Russians know China will remain neutral, and Vladivostok has strong defenses. A direct siege would become another Gallipoli. NATO too is sending reinforcements to Europe, scraping the Western Hemisphere clean. NATO still has a manpower advantage over the Warsaw Pact, even now that all German manpower has been lost. Merchant ships are busy hauling ammunitions and weapons from the other side of the Atlantic, and millions of men are finally arriving in Europe, but not fast enough. It'll take months for the draftees to hit the front lines. Sending inadequately trained troops to the front will always end in a disaster. Both sides have incredibly high losses due to the lethality of modern weaponry. However, the Soviets are more willing to accept those casualties. When a formation on the front line is barraged by artillery shells, it takes 40% or more casualties within an hour. The survivors quickly become more concerned with their survival than the continuation of the battle. Besides manpower, both sides have lots of equipment stockpiled, thousands of tanks, planes, and artillery. However, NATO has an enormous industrial advantage over the Warsaw Pact. But still, it is impossible to pump out a meaningful amount of weaponry during this short and violent conflict. In this war, you fight with what you have, what you can get out of storage to the field now. This is a come-as-you-are kind of war. We aren't just taking Europe back from the Soviets with light infantry. The Soviets can draw from their massive stockpiles of old equipment. There's a reason they spent money maintaining 20,000 T-55s instead of just scrapping them. Not possible. A conventional wide bombing campaign in Germany, 1944 style, would need hundreds of bombers flying into the teeth of air defenses and interceptors that would make Hanoi look like a walk in Central Park. All airports in Germany are lost, mainly because there are T-72s parked in the runways. Sure, the Soviets' economy can't sustain a prolonged war, but neither can the West's public opinion. NATO has organized a good defensive line along the Rhine. The good defensive lines is the exact thing the Soviets routinely destroyed in 1944 against the Wehrmacht. But if they manage to break that line, we'll organize another one, and another one, and another one. NATO will never lose, but we'll never win, and for sure we'll never march on Moscow. In a conventional war. Gentlemen of the General Command, please.
General Bernard Rogers asks the permission to use nuclear weapons. After a brief consultation with the other Allied leaders, Reagan gives the permission for the use of tactical nuclear weapons.
December the 22nd, 6 o'clock in the morning. The USS Iowa in the Norwegian Sea fires 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles, each with a 50 kiloton yield. For comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was 16 kilotons. The targets are bridges over the Vistula River, from Danzig to Warsaw, all the way until Krakow. They are followed by the launch of 8 Polaris A-3 ballistic missiles by the Royal Navy's Resolution-class submarine HMS Revenge. Each missile has 3 200-kiloton warheads. At 11 o'clock, an F-111A launches 6 AGM-69 SRAM missiles with a 17-kiloton warhead over targets that have not been sufficiently damaged. Pandora's box has been opened. The nuclear war begins. The choice of targets was a political decision. West German Chancellor Kohl refused to authorize the deployment of nuclear weapons in East German territory. He does not want Germany turned into a nuclear moonscape. Mitterrand, too, does not want nukes used in Germany, not because he loves the Germans, but because with the windy winter weather, a strike in Germany could contaminate vast areas in France with fallout. No nukes have been used on the Soviet Union, and only tactical nukes against military targets in a relatively limited zone have been targeted. NATO hopes to avoid retaliation. It is a vain hope. The difference between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons is, from the viewpoint of its victims, negligible. From Warsaw and Moscow, media reports are describing an apocalyptic scenario with 2 million dead. Some Swedish media are speaking out about at least 300,000 dead, and another 300,000 are likely due to fallout if they are not properly sheltered and treated. The CIA estimates that 25,000 Polish citizens are probably dead. After 24 hours, there is Soviet retaliation. SS-20 ballistic missiles fired from the Ural Mountains hit the airbase in Aviano, Italy, and the city of Antwerp, Belgium, the site of an important harbor. The targets are each hit with 3 150-kiloton warheads. The Soviets often used multiple warheads due to warhead unreliability. The nukes detonate close to each other in a triangular target pattern to cause maximum area damage. December the 23rd, an SS-22 ballistic missile hits NATO Supreme Headquarters north of Mons, Belgium, with a single 500-kiloton warhead. The speed and the short flight time of the SS-20 missile gives NATO no chance to defend the targets. The carriers at sea are difficult to hit. They move too fast, and the data provided by Soviet satellites is too dated by the time it is to be used to gain a firing solution on the carriers. But the USS Kennedy, which is supporting an Israeli division in Beirut, is very close to the Syrian coast. Too close. Direct observation is possible. At 9 p.m., 4 SS-20 ballistic missiles, deployed from the southern Ural Mountains, are launched against the USS Kennedy. A total of 12 warheads hit the waters off the Lebanese coast. 3 of them malfunction, but 1 warhead detonates 1 kilometer from the carrier. It sweeps the carrier deck of aircraft and breaks the hull. The USS Kennedy is sunk. During the night, an S-23 180mm heavy gun fires 2 1-kiloton nuclear shells on Dormagen in Germany, hitting the positions of the US 170th Infantry Brigade and the German 26th Parachute Division. A Frog 7 with a 1-kiloton warhead hits Brederveen in the Netherlands, where the US 2nd Cavalry Regiment is entrenched. Patriot missiles fail to stop the Frog 7. First-line troops are already dispersed and sheltered in bunkers and fortifications. Losses are contained. The Soviets used notably fewer nuclear weapons than NATO used, and no nukes were used on France and the United Kingdom. Both nations have nuclear arsenals that could be employed in retaliation. The Soviets are hoping to avoid a nuclear escalation. It is another vain hope. The NATO response is immediate, almost simultaneous to Soviet launches. An FA-18 drops B-61 nuclear bombs with a 0.3 kiloton yield on the Soviet 9th Guard Tank Division on the outskirts of Mannheim. Lance ballistic missiles with neutron warheads hit troop concentrations and ammunition depots in Dortmund, the already devastated city of Frankfurt, and Bochum. Half-kiloton nuclear shells fired by 155mm howitzers hit the Soviet 32nd Infantry Division at Duisburg. 2 MGM-52 Lance ballistic missiles fall on the East German 8th Motorized Division at Essen. December the 24th, 6 a.m., Christmas Eve. A B-52H from the British base of Greenham Common launches a single AGM-86 ALCM nuclear cruise missile on Smolensk, a major transportation junction between Soviet and European rail systems. Russian motherland has been hit. There will be vengeance.
December the 25th. The nuclear ballistic missile submarine Akula TK-208 Dmitry Donskoy, NATO reporting name Typhoon, is hidden under the ice pack of the deep Arctic Ocean. With a displacement of 48,000 tons, 175 meters length, and a crew of 160 persons, the Akula is the largest submarine ever built. It's armed with 20 SSN-20 missiles with 10 100-kiloton warheads each, with a range of 8,000 kilometers. At 7 o'clock, it receives a launch order for 5 missiles. No one in the crew knows what targets they are about to hit, but they do know that the missiles are targeted on US cities, and they know what this means. Despite the Kremlin considering this only a retaliation for the Smolensk bombing, it will be the start of a full-scale nuclear exchange. But there is no other choice than to execute the order. In the Arctic night, the Akula slips out towards the launch position off Spitsbergen.
The physical and psychological effect of nuclear weapons on the battlefield has been enormous. There are almost no fights. Troops are now only looking for shelter, taking cover wherever it is possible, in tunnels, foxholes, trenches, using tanks as cover, and waiting out the storm. Soldiers are not really trained for a nuclear battle. Nobody can really be trained for such a thing.
Meanwhile, the commander of the Aquila, let's give him a name, Nikolai Brabian, a 35 years old Armenian, is unusually taking too long a time to find a good place for the launch. The Arctic polar ice cap in winter is up to 20 meters thick. The Aquila could break through up to 3 meters of ice, but the commander is looking for a place with thinner ice. The R-29 missiles are rather fragile things. If thick ice is moving around, there is a risk that the missile could hit an iceberg on its way up. Protected from detection by the ice, in strict radio silence, the Aquila continues the search.
In the USA, a huge flow of encrypted radio communications has been detected and monitored since 7 p.m. There is no way to decrypt them, but the format of the messages is very suspect. NATO tracks the position of the messages, and the suspects are confirmed. The Soviets have alerted a submarine under the polar ice pack. NATO knows that there are Delta-3 and Typhoon-class nuclear ballistic missile submarines hidden somewhere under the Arctic ice. There is no real possibility of finding them. The ice is incredibly noisy. It disrupts sensors and can hide the loudest Soviet subs. Reagan has two choices: initiate a nuclear-first strike, escalating World War III to a full nuclear war by launching over 3,200 nukes, targeting 1,000 sites in the Soviet Union. The Soviets will retaliate in kind, killing at least 40 million Americans. It will be difficult to be re-elected in 1988. The other choice is to wait and see what happens. Reagan chooses to wait.
3 a.m. The Aquila reaches a good launch position, a patch of water with thin ice on the edge of the ice pack off the Queen Elizabeth Islands. Now it has to break the ice, then it will launch all 50 missiles, one every 12 seconds. The launch has to be done as quickly as possible. When a submarine starts surfacing through ice, it is horrendously noisy, like a car accident which goes on for several seconds. For sure, all NATO units in that zone are hunting for the Aquila. Only the Kremlin knows the targets. Augusta, Boston, Detroit, Norfolk, Charleston. 10 atomic warheads each. Not all the nukes will hit the targets. Most of these cities are well protected, and some of the warheads will be defective, but there will certainly be massive destruction. But the commander, with the consent of the political commissar, asks again for confirmation. To communicate, the Aquila uses radio buoys. They program the message, leave, then the message is transmitted later. It's a very secure method, but it will take 6 hours to have an answer. These 6 hours will be crucial.
Diplomats and cooler minds are working feverishly to prevent further nuclear escalation. Someone starts to understand that he will not just lose the war, but die. December the 27th, at 0050 hours, Moscow time, Gromyko calls Reagan on the nuclear hotline. This is the first time a member of the Soviet collective leadership has contacted the US president. We don't know what was said in their conversation, but after the call, both parties agreed to a ceasefire. The confirmation launch order for the Soviet nuclear ballistic submarine will never arrive. The last casualties are on the morning of December the 27th on a dirt road in the Alps in Austria, where an Italian platoon, who has known nothing of the cessation of hostilities, fires on Ukrainian soldiers in a mortar position. Then, it is quiet on all fronts.
In the following days, the ceasefire became an armistice, based on the return on the status quo, antebellum. Americans dangerously insisted on nothing but an unconditional victory. The British too are in vengeful mood, but although they have not yet received nukes, the luck cannot last forever. The Germans, Italians, and French are more than satisfied watching the Soviets return home. This war must stop. A fight with Russia is not like bullying Serbia. The Warsaw Pact withdraw from occupied countries rather quickly. Some units even disband, leaving the heavy equipments and simply returning home. NATO claims victory. They expelled the Soviets from their countries after an unprovoked attack. Soviets too claim victory. They prevented NATO's nuclear attack and removed the threat of nuclear missiles stationed in Europe. There will never be a peace conference. Warsaw Pact and NATO, officially, remains in a state of war. Now, it's time for Reconstruction. Large sections of Europe have been trashed for the third time in less than 70 years. The life in Europe will be austere for the next years. However, the war was violent, but short. Governments function normally, industry and infrastructures are not too damaged, agricultural capability is virtually intact. Large destructions are relatively limited to few cities, the ones bombed with nukes. Urban fighting has not taken place anywhere on a large scale. Rebuilding the nuked cities starts soon after the war, as happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There is an increase in cancer mortality, but the fallout from nukes loses a lot of its potential after some years. An atomic explosion is different from an accident like Chernobyl, because a power plant has an enormous quantity of uranium. With the exception of Mons, all nukes used in Europe were airbursts. The nukes detonated high enough that the fireball didn't touch the ground. An airburst is the optimum method of attacking a city, since it maximizes the area covered with blast overpressure. But the area hit by an airburst usually does not suffer significant lingering radiation. The hot air takes most of the fallout into the upper atmosphere, where it dilutes and decays before falling back to Earth. Germany is in bad shape. It's the chief battleground in Europe, so no surprise here. Belgium and the Netherlands too are in bad shape. They were on the front line for weeks. Italy had its cities hit by nukes, and a lot of Scud and aerial bombing over the northern city. Poland is the most destroyed country. France has the Atlantic Harbor and almost all airports wrecked, but Paris is not even damaged beyond some broken windows. London suffers less devastation than during 4 years of German carpet bombings. Spain, Portugal, and Greece had only some sporadic bombing here and there. Turkey something more. In the northern regions of Norway, there is almost not a single house intact, but the rest of the country has few damages. Austria had not great battles on its soil, only their mountains had been bombed by both sides for quite a while. Soviet Union suffers supply shortages and famine. However, the Great Patriotic War was far worse. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia emerged from the war devastated in all its communication systems, but the cities are almost intact. In Denmark, most of the damages are due to NATO air and naval bombings against the entrenched Polish occupation troops. Europe will rise again, as it has with every conflict going back to the last century's wars. Will Europeans learn to live in peace without inventing craps like European Union, or at least not to fight a world war on their own soil? We don't know. Australia and New Zealand are intact, with casualties only in the Korean War. The United States are now the only superpower. As in the previous world wars, they are not hit in their own territory, keep the war at distance, and comes out from the war in a better shape than before. In the aftermath of the war, all the green, communist parties, and leftist movements across Europe are gone. Hammers and sickles disappear, wherever possible. Western culture considers progressives not only useful idiots, but enemies. Yuri Andropov died in February 9, 1983. With a war crisis still going on, the new General Secretary of the Communist Party will not be the sick Chernenko. Grigory Vasilyevich Romanov, strengthened by his connections to the military, is elected. In some way, after 70 years, a Romanov is again on the Russian throne. Romanov is a hardliner. There will be no perestroika, no glasnost, and the Soviet Union will not dissolve. Separatists will be crushed, like in Grozny. Only Baltic states will gain the independence in January 1987, allowing the presence of Soviet bases on their soil. After the war, Soviet Union is isolated. All Western nations limit trade and shipping to them. But unlike Germany in World War I and World War II, the Soviets have the resources to sustain themselves, although with a lot of troubles, and this situation cannot last forever. Russia will follow the same economical path made by China in our timeline, made of reforms without endangering the power of the establishment. They will even place some orders for Boeing to keep USA quiet. The Warsaw Pact disbands quickly. 1984, November 4th, elections in Poland, Solidarnosc wins. December 18th, Hungary, elections with a multi-party system. June 27, 1985, Václav Havel becomes president of Czechoslovakia. July 30th, Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu is overthrown and executed, with his wife, Elena. August 1st, 1985, the Berlin Wall is breached and Germany is reunified. After the fall of Warsaw Pact, there will be a Marshall Plan, headed by Jimmy Carter, to reconstruct Poland. Middle East peace process will be a difficult issue, as always. But after a nuclear war, the long-lasting Middle East conflict is a problem no one cares about. And there's no shortage of factions that you can pay a reasonable price to fight each other, keeping them busy. All left-wing revolutionary armies everywhere in Latin America are repressed using violence without drawing much notice. Communist militias are useful in street fighting, but they are not going to last long against serious troops. The naval blockade on Cuba continued, and after 4 months, they have enough. There is a military coup led by Arnaldo Ochoa, former commander of the Expeditionary Corps in Angola, and during this war, Nicaragua. Castro flees into exile in Moscow, helped by a Soviet brigade in Cuba. Yugoslavia falls apart soon, in 1986. North and South Korea remain divided. The leadership of Seoul is the first that does not want a reunited Korea. The cost of rebuilding North Korea would be crushing. Japan is rearming rapidly after the war, with all that it implies. The nuclear power become the greatest source of energy. Having survived nuclear bombing, people is now less scared by civilian nuclear power. Incidents are barely noticed by the media. The threat of the annihilation of the human species by nuclear bombs is all one thing, but if you really want to unnerve people, tell them you'll rise the energy prices. The United Nations, useless as always, are dissolved after the war, as the League of Nations after World War II. No helps to Africa. Europe has its hands full. Famine devastates Africa, so, at least here, nothing has changed. Future historians will discuss on who is to blame for this war. If the war was really launched to preempt an attack that never existed, it would be the stupidest war of all time, after World War I. We will never know if Able Archer was the cover of a real nuclear attack or not. The US denied the accusations. The Soviets attacked without any reason, invading half Europe, causing 1.5 million deaths all over the world. However, NATO started the nuclear war, and some NATO's pre-war actions were dangerously provocative. When a NATO aircraft violated Soviet airspace, when US submarines entered their naval bases, they were playing with fire. Russian historians will put the blame on Reagan. From their perspective, it wasn't such a great idea to provoke the Soviets by calling them evil empire, sticking Pershings all over Europe. But almost all histories of World War III are going to be written by Americans, or their allies. So for the next 100 years, Soviet Union will be compared to Nazism, and Warsaw Pact to Axis. Reagan will be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for being the man who ends World War III.
And now? I would love to tell you that, after this war, people has learned to live in peace and harmony, and the war is never a solution. Unluckily, the world leaders learned a different lesson. The lesson they learned is that a nuclear war doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. A nuclear war can be survived and won. Some tens or so nuclear detonations and the smoke in the atmosphere from burnings in cities and factories had negligible climate effects, a global cooling of only a couple of degrees, as happened after big volcanic eruptions such as Tambora 1815. The lesson the world learned is that the nukes are the only weapons that matter. No possessing nuclear weapons is the #1 cause of being targeted with nukes. Any governments hurry to get nukes, as they are the only guarantor of survival. 7 countries are already nuclear powers. In the following years, other countries will develop the nuclear technology. Germany, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, Netherlands, Canada, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, Australia, Brazil, India, Pakistan. Other nations will buy nukes from them. Year 1991. Iraq invades Kuwait. Saddam Hussein has an unspecified number of nukes, sold them by the French. Saudi Arabia has nukes, purchased from USA. Iran is a nuclear power, thanks to Soviet technology. Have fun.